Sri Lankan politics at the moment understand that this is not a vote for Marxist rule, and they understand that he's not a textbook Marxist who's come here to implement Marxist policies.
Welcome to The Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our very, very special guest today is Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan. He's been with us once or twice before. He's the director for the Center for Law and Security Studies and also a visiting instructor of the National Defence College in Colombo. And in my mind, he's one of the finest analysts, not just in the subcontinent, but probably entire Asia. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you taking time out for this.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's always a delight to converse with you. Thank you.
You know, I wanted to talk to you about, of course, the Sri Lankan elections and what it means. But subsequently, I also wanted to talk about, what happens to Sri Lanka and India, given the other changes in the world. So let's start off with Sri Lanka first. A sweep for Dissanayake. And interestingly, it seems that he's probably the first Marxist to be elected president. I mean, as in a full, fair and free and fair elections. I mean, I don't know. I can't remember anybody else. I mean, the others are all tin-pot dictators who claim to have democracies, but I don't think I've ever heard of a Marxist coming in and sitting right up there saying Dan's the president in a free and fair election. Would that be a correct assessment, or do you know of anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, especially not on a national level, right? So, for example, in your country, in India, you of course have Kerala and West Bengal and examples like that. But on a national level, yes, there's a big deal. And even by Sri Lankan standards, he is the first leader to get the vote of both the North and the South at the same time. So after all these decades of the North and the South squabbling with wars and insurgencies and all that, it's quite ironic that it's a Marxist who's managed to be the common banner that unites the two.
Mm-hmm. But, it's interesting that you have a Marxist. Does that sort of, influence, let's say, how the rest of the world reacts with you?
I don't think so. I think most people who follow Sri Lankan politics at the moment understand that this is not a vote for Marxist rule. And they understand that he's not a textbook Marxist who's come here to implement Marxist policies. As we discussed the last time, the vote for him is more a vote of both hope and anger. Hope for the future and anger for the past. So that's certainly how it needs to be interpreted. And to be fair, most people who've been observing Sri Lankan politics over the last few months, I think they understand that. I think they quite clearly understand that simply painting him as a conventional Marxist would be factually incorrect.
Mm-hmm. But let's say, if we were to look at just India-Sri Lanka ties, or let's take a step back. You just mentioned that a vote for change and a vote for new things. So basically, I think the electorate is wiping the slate clean and starting afresh with a new face, with a new lot of, even the people who are coming into, into power now, they're all basically people who are new to the whole game. The whole dynastic politics and all that seems to have gone now.
Absolutely. I mean, in that sense, it's very, very similar to what we would call a populist election, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So many of the things that the people want in terms of, as you said, wiping the slate clean or wanting the deep state to not have an iron hold over how the day-to-days of the common citizens go in terms of dynastic politics and all that. Yes, it's a huge vote for changing the political landscape and culture itself, rather than simply just a vote for a new government.
Yes, but when you have such, you said hope as well, what would be, over the next 5 years, what do you think would be his primary challenge there? Because there's a lot of expectations that come into play here.
So the primary challenge is clearly going to be economic in nature, because right now, as we see with elections all over the world, economics is one of the major aspirations of any voter in any part of the world, simply because of the major challenges in the world economy at the moment. So he will need to boost tourism. That is one major challenge that he has, one major milestone that he needs to hit. And he also needs to start helping the country generate income. So right now, as we discussed the last time, one of the major problems that we have is our inability to generate a lot of income as an economy, which means that when 2027 comes and we need to pay back those loans again, we're going to be in trouble again. So his major challenge will be economic, and all the foreign policy and domestic policy balancing acts that he has to now put on will have to be in service of this economic need.
And how difficult a challenge is that, given that, when you try to balance against IMF loans and what the public wants, sometimes it gets very difficult.
Well, I would say almost impossible. So we're not really looking at something that is practically, in my judgment, possible to the fullest extent. But there is a certain partial extent through which this can be done. And once again, this is where a sharper understanding of foreign policy is required. Sri Lanka has this non-alignment obsession. And even if you listen to many of the geopolitical experts in the Asian region, they love the word hedging, and they keep using that keyword like it's some kind of masterful strategy, even though hedging has done absolutely nothing for anybody. So if we continue to follow a hedging or a non-alignment strategy, I don't think that will reap us any real economic benefits. I would be far more comfortable, even though it would be more challenging politically, I would certainly be far more comfortable with us following a policy of alignment. It's not my job to determine which nation the country needs to be aligned with, but I do think we require alignment at this juncture.
Do you think something similar to what India is doing would also work, where you align with 2 or 3 different nations based on needs?
So I think India has a unique luxury. I think when you're a regional power, this multi-alignment and strategic autonomy line of thought is sustainable. So India, for instance, can get away with being probably the only country in the world that has a great relationship with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. So you might find countries that have a good relationship with one of them or 2 of them, but I think India is one of the few countries in the world that can genuinely say it has a deep friendship with all 3. And you can get away with that when you're a regional power. But Sri Lanka trying to play a balancing act, we've tried to play that over the last several decades, and I've simply not seen it giving us anything in return, unfortunately.
That's interesting because, let's talk about India and Sri Lanka. Do you think this new election will change anything?
I think the vote that they've gotten in the north might change things, in the sense that I don't think even the NPP was expecting a 2/3 majority. In fact, you had the president even mentioning in a speech a few days ago that a 2/3 majority would be dangerous for a country, and that governments in the past have used it to kind of barrel through with unpopular reforms and things like that. And lo and behold, we find out today that they themselves have a 2/3 majority. So, and a big part of that was because of the unexpected gains that they got in the north. So now they might have to recalibrate some of their perspectives on how they want to conduct their foreign policy and their engagement with the rest of the world and all that. I do hope that it leads to more India-Sri Lanka connectivity specifically, because I see that as being the only way out of the economic mess that we're in. So my hope is that they will be nudged towards that decision. But overall, I don't see them veering away too much from the traditional non-alignment hedging mindset.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, you're asking for change, but you're not changing.
I'm not a fan of non-alignment and hedging. I am much more a statistical fan of looking at history and looking at what types of foreign policy works. And I think the history of Asia in the 20th and 21st century clearly shows that for small nations like us having alignment is what gives you benefits in the long run. So that's where I hope the government will go. But unfortunately, there's a huge uphill journey that any political party here will have to partake in if they want to align, because you have many vested interests that belong to many different countries that are entrenched here, and you would be accused of being a puppet of either China or India or the United States if you even start talking about alignment and all that. So there are political challenges, but logically, India-Sri Lanka connectivity is the only way to get us out of the economic troubles we're in.
I remember in the last interview we did, you had brought about the same thing, that we're not connected at all. I mean, and It's interesting too, because a lot of people seem to think that we are very well plugged in with each other, but I mean, you made it very clear that we're not. So
it's as I said earlier, it's shocking. That's the only way I can describe it. Considering the proximity and the cultural and civilizational proximity as well, we are very, very sparsely connected.
Mm-hmm. So is that a problem with India? Is that a problem with Sri Lanka? Or, I mean, bilateral, where is the problem in the connectivities?
So I think both sides need to be blamed for this to a certain extent. Sri Lanka, like any small country, is unfortunately fated to be cautious, even paranoid, when dealing with larger powers. And since we are a parliamentary democracy, you have pro-US parties, pro-China parties, pro-India parties. So that becomes, you have the unions involved and you have the media involved, and all of that becomes a hodgepodge of many different identities. So we've never really had a clear-cut, consistent foreign policy where we stay with a singular partner. Our partners and our benefactors keep changing based on whoever's in power here. And from India's perspective, there's a lot that India could have done, which it didn't. For example, I think we mentioned this in our last conversation as well, parity when it comes to trade, parity when it comes to openness of markets and giving us access to Indian markets and things like that. And once again, India as a regional power obviously has different strategic calculations than Sri Lanka. So for example, if a Chinese research vessel comes in, obviously to us it's not a big deal, but to New Delhi it is. And the Chinese would tell us that this is just a research vessel, so why are you guys being unfair to us? So we are now forced to play this balancing act because of strategic calculations way beyond our level of control. So that's where I think India too has been somewhat inconvenient to deal with. But once again, this just comes with the regular dynamic of a large country and a small country dealing with each other. We can't really blame any party here. This is simply how geography works.
No, it's not a blame thing I'm trying to arrive at. I'm trying to understand that, ideally, if you look at it economically, why would India have a problem with opening its market to Sri Lanka? I mean, it's not that you can flood us with something or the other. I mean, as I mentioned last time, I missed my Dilma tea.
Yeah, and that's a good question. And perhaps there are certain invisible business interests that are preventing this. We could always go into speculation, but there has to be something there that's obstructing it, or it wouldn't really exist.
Mm-hmm. Now let's expand the thing slightly more. We've just had the US elections. Will that have some impact on the way Sri Lanka deals with the rest of the world, or the US deals with Sri Lanka?
I think there will be indirect effects. Maybe not specific events or effects that are unique to Sri Lanka. So if we were to just briefly look at the South Asian picture at the moment, I would say we have Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, and to a certain extent Afghanistan, which are directly impacted by Trump's presidency because he has very direct positions regarding these countries. Whereas Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Maldives, we are affected by it in an indirect way, as in any recalibration of US engagement with India or Pakistan or Bangladesh is likely to have a spillover effect of some kind. And this is where we need to be smart as well. So, for example, if Marco Rubio does indeed push for a much deeper level of economic connectivity between Washington and New Delhi in order to, let's say, serve as some kind of thorn in Beijing's side, then is Colombo in a position to exploit that? Is Colombo in a position to take advantage of that inevitable economic and diplomatic boom that will pop up over the next 4 or 5 years as that alignment kind of comes together? So, in one sense, the recent victory here, the good thing we need to take out of it for foreign policy is that it's been a huge blow to political separatists in the north of Sri Lanka. As in, even though the LTT and militancy itself has been vanquished, it's been the old, lazy political class in the north that is, number one, fragmented. If they had been united, they would have been able to do something for the people. But these people are also self-centered, that the varying Tamil parties in the north simply refuse to unite together. And number two, they've not really done anything to meet the aspirations of the people. So now we have the NPP that's coming up, which is a national party. So this is the first time that an actual national party is winning a significant, a visible victory in the north in like the last 30 years or something like that. So in that sense, the foreign policy alignment hopefully will be big picture minded, and hopefully will be able to gear towards the geographic realignments that might happen with the Trump presidency.
There's something I was, about to ask you. Who are the sort of, people who could sort of work the way you just suggested in the new cabinet? I mean, who do you think is going to be who would you think would be a good foreign minister or something to have?
Right. Unfortunately, I cannot, and the reason that I cannot is purely because when we look at the way in which foreign policy is run here, we simply have no idea what the long-term aspirations of the NPP are, or what exactly their foreign policy goals are. So there will be people within the NPP and who are friendly with the NPP and whom they might consider to be foreign policy experts who will get it. But in terms of me actually being able to recommend somebody, once again, as I stated, I am more of an alignment guy, while anybody who would realistically be in the running for that position would be a non-alignment person. So I wouldn't particularly see eye to eye with them.
What about the bureaucracy? Would they be able to ensure some kind of a change there? Sometimes, a foreign minister is only as good as his team, and that's the bureaucratic bunch, right?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the foreign service here is as influential as, let's say, the IAS or the IFS or the IPS in India. So the hold that the bureaucrats have here is a lot weaker than what we see in India, for instance. But once again, if you look at the way that the foreign ministry here functions, it's far more of a machinistic position where you implement what the ruling party's foreign policy agenda is, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Which is why when we look at Sri Lanka's history since independence, our foreign policy is completely aligned with whichever political party is in power. So historically, if the SLFP was in power, pro-China, pro-non-alignment. If the UNP was in power, pro-West. When the Rajapaksas were in power, it was pro-China again. So it's not like the bureaucrats ever had a leash on the politicians. It was the politically elected parties that completely dictated our foreign policy direction.
The other thing that I was really keen to ask you about is that Trump, as you know, has sort of, made it a policy that I'm going to get tough on China. Now, a lot of people, for instance, in India are saying that if that happens, we can be hopeful of ability for us because, we align with it. And more importantly, they're also looking at the economic fallout, as in the China +1 kind of a thing. Is there some kind of a thing that might also resonate with Sri Lanka? How Trump deals with China?
Not as much as India, because I think in Sri Lanka, the idea that China is an ally is still very strong, because Sri Lanka doesn't have the same kind of geopolitical competition with Beijing, obviously. So most Sri Lankans, I think, would rather have their options open. We would want a strong India and we would want a strong China as well. And I think most people who don't really think deeply about foreign policy which would much rather that be the case where we can hedge, so to speak. In terms of exploiting India's rise, I think there's a case to be made for that. There's a very tangible, rational case to be made here for why Sri Lankans should be interested in being Canada rather than Mexico. And I think I used this analogy earlier as well, where are we going to be a power that wants to benefit from the economic rise of our neighbor, or do we want to be forever paranoid of them and stay muddling in the middle, so to speak?
Again, this is perhaps not related so much to Sri Lanka as such, but I know that, you have a lot of interest in what's been going on in the US, and you've been following it very clearly. What do you think Trump's new picks mean for the region? I mean, mean for the world, because half of them don't even seem to have any government experience.
Yeah, I mean, and what's his name? Pete Hegseth is a Fox News anchor as well, who's now going to be the defense secretary. So I think the first lesson we need to learn from this is that Trump has not changed in that he thrives on uncertainty and taking people by surprise and doing what's least expected of him. So some people in his cabinet, you could say, are straight up neocons. Some like Marco Rubio, you could say, is a hawk, but not necessarily a neoconservative. You have some like Tulsi Gabbard, who's who essentially used to be a Democratic congresswoman and who is quite anti-war in many ways, and she's going to head the intelligence services now. So you have a pretty eclectic mix of different people who stand for different things. I mean, Robert Kennedy Jr., my God, talk about a dynasty, right? So in that sense, Trump has people who've come over from the Democratic Party. He has people who belong to the old Bush-Cheney neocon establishment. He also has the new generation of hawks like Rubio. So I think we can expect him to be somewhat harder on China. Will it actually match the rhetoric? I'm not too sure yet. I think we can also see them pushing for peace in Russia and Ukraine. Will they be as pro-Russia as people think? Once again, I have reservations. Only time will tell, because there are many people in the current administration who are very, very anti-Russia, for instance. So I think he will journey on in the basic contours of foreign policy that he set in his speeches and all that. But will he actually go through with the rhetoric to the fullest? I have reservations there.
That I can understand, but even if he does, does half of what he has promised to do, it's going to shake up the world in many ways. I mean,
sir. Yeah, go on.
I was just thinking about climate, for instance. I mean, that's going to take a big hit. It's a drill, baby, drill. I don't know where it's going to take the world. And Sri Lanka, is also, I think, trying very hard to get green and not get into a polluting thing. So there will be conflict there, right?
Certainly, and this is once again the problem, or rather the challenge, of economic imperatives being the backbone of your mandate. So, for instance, the biggest beneficiary of the Russia-Ukraine war, for instance, even more so than the arms companies, have been the LNG companies. American LNG companies have essentially replaced Russian oil as the primary supplier of energy to Western Europe. And all of that happened over the last few years when the war broke out. So we've gone from the Iraq war, where the United States had to get militarily involved to safeguard energy interests, to now becoming a net exporter of energy. So that itself has recalibrated. And as you said, they're not really, it's not really going to be practically possible for Trump to sacrifice the economic opportunities with drilling and all that against the environmental concerns. Pragmatically, Trump cannot retain that working class coalition that he currently has if he starts going greener.
Okay, that sound makes sense. What about tariffs? Because I see that in India there's a lot of concern about tariffs and all that stuff. Trump has been pretty transactional on that. Would that have some kind of a? Is the US a big market for Sri Lanka?
So I wouldn't say the US is a huge market for Sri Lanka in terms of anything, because once again, we are not a huge income generating industrial nation. We do export things like tea and all that, but tourism and remittances, labor remittances from other parts of the world, it's these things that make up key sort of chunks of our income. So as we industrialize further, that's when things like tariffs and all that will have a major impact. What it can do, however, is if it does bolster local American businesses, then these guys are not going to be happy as any American company is with the local American market. American companies, once they grow beyond a certain size, as we know, look for markets abroad as well. So maybe this will create a new era of regional economic power centers. So we're going, the transition is basically, as you know, going to be from this completely interconnected world of supply and demand and economics, and is going to go into Make in India, Make in America, and things like that. So if at all Sri Lanka can benefit from something, it will be in that transition.
That also makes sense. We are running a bit out of time, but let me end with another question that's been, that I've been wanting to ask you anyway, even not on this particular thing. You're coming back to Indo-Sri Lanka again. You said that India's markets are a bit closed. I mean, India should open up its markets for Sri Lanka. At the same time, India is also selling a lot of stuff to Sri Lanka at the same time. And not just selling, consumer goods, but also things like petrol and stuff like that. How does that balance out? I'm not getting the thing here. I mean, doesn't the balance of trade also impact what the IMF dictates and the dictates come into play here?
It does, but it wouldn't be, it's not so unfairly tyrannical. It's not like India's oppressing or suppressing Sri Lanka by doing that. It just happens to be a lopsided relationship that you often find when you look at trade partnerships between large countries and small countries. And this is why, even though I'm at risk of flogging a dead horse, I'm forced to keep coming back to this issue of connectivity, because this then becomes a very natural solution to the problem. Often these lopsided things, dynamics exist precisely because of a lack of connectivity. And the more connectivity we have in terms of trade, in terms of energy investments, in terms of India actually helping us become economically healthy again, connectivity will be a very natural disinfectant, so to speak, from this wound, rather than us having to perform some kind of surgery now to artificially fix the wound.
And what about the IMF strictures? You think that would be easy to navigate through? That's my last question. I mean,
so once again, the new government has predictably found it pretty hard to get the IMF to change its terms and all that. I mean, let's face it, the IMF has dealt with 100 countries like us, many of whom were even in worse straits than we were, right? So the IMF has dealt with a lot of parties like this. They will be very, very reluctant to change their terms and things like that. So this will be a challenge to move forward with. But once again, we have time, and hopefully, as connectivity, as our relationship with India grows, hopefully some of these can be very naturally solved rather than artificially fixed, so to speak.
Absolutely. That's I think that should be how it should be, I think. But let's all look forward to that happening then in that case. And I certainly look forward to having you again to talk about not just, Sri Lanka, but on other, as I just mentioned, I wanted to hear your views on the American election, because I think that's a very fresh perspective. So I will have to sign off here. sadly, because I had a whole bunch of other questions listed, but I'll get on to them next time. Thank you so
I
very
just
much.
want to thank you for having me. It's been such a delight as always.
No, I mean, I'm grateful that you agreed at such short notice. I know you're very busy, but I will be on your case again and again, and not just for Sri Lanka. Thank you so very much. That was Nilanthan Niruthan, one of the finest analytical minds in Asia, talking to us about not just Sri Lanka and India and what the recent elections mean, but also about the global dynamics and how that impacts both Sri Lanka and India and the road ahead. One can only hope that the people who matter are listening to our conversation and take this forward. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to having you again. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.